"I want you to play with me," the woman said to the most dangerous man in Chicago. That voice was so small, so broken, it almost got swallowed by the noise of the park. Vince Carano looked up from his phone. Standing in front of him was a woman 28, maybe 30. Hard to tell. Her brown hair was matted and tangled, like no one had run a hand through it in months. She wore an oversized gray hoodie, so faded and torn at the sleeves you couldn't even tell what color it used to be. Her sneakers were falling apart, no socks, and on her wrist a cheap silver chain with a tiny cross, pressed tight against her skin like it was the only thing she had left in this world. But her eyes were what stopped him cold. They weren't the eyes of someone begging. They weren't afraid. They weren't shaking. They were staring straight into the face of a man who'd ordered people killed without flinching, and they didn't look away, like she'd already seen worse than him, or like she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She was too calm to be homeless, too steady to be crazy, too fearless or too shattered to be standing in front of a man like him. But there she was, right on the pathway of Grant Park, with the last golden light of a Chicago autumn pouring over her like she was the only person God hadn't given up on yet, looking at Vince Carano like he was the last human being on earth she could turn to. He slid his phone into his pocket. He looked into those dark, still eyes that didn't beg, didn't tremble, didn't cry, they just asked, with a kind of quiet that cracked something deep inside his chest he didn't even know was there. He stared at her for a few seconds and couldn't find a single word. In 8 years of running an empire built on blood and silence, he'd seen just about everything, but he'd never seen anything like this. And what she'd say in the next few seconds would shatter everything Vince Carano thought he knew about power, about control, and about himself. If this story hits your soul the way it hit mine, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe and turn on that bell so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that park bench in Chicago, where a broken woman and a dangerous man were about to change each other's lives forever. That morning, everything was still normal until Vince Carano stepped out of the private elevator of the penthouse on the 42nd floor in the Gold Coast. On the marble table by the door, an envelope lay there. New sender name. New postage stamp. Only his name written by hand in black ink, in unfamiliar handwriting. Tommy Zhao, his driver and bodyguard, stood by the door and said it had already been there when he arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning, and no one had seen who delivered it. Vince opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of documents about 20 pages thick, notarized copies, screenshots of text messages, and a candid photograph taken at a law office he didn't recognize. He didn't need to read it all to understand. Just by skimming the first few pages, he saw the name Renata Voss everywhere, along with numbers, signatures, and lines of text no one sent to the person they loved unless they were planning a betrayal. Renata, 2 years together. 2 years he had let her step into his life, into his home, into meetings where outsiders were never allowed to sit. He hadn't read every detail yet. He didn't want to know exactly what she was doing, but the instincts of a man who had survived 8 years in Chicago's underworld told him that what lay inside that envelope was big enough to bring everything down. He set the documents on the table, stood still for a moment, and looked out at the glass wall, down at the city stretching beneath him. The city he almost owned, the city someone was trying to rip out of his hands. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything. He didn't call anyone. He just stood there and realized that for the first time in a very long while, he couldn't breathe. Not because of fear. Vince Carano wasn't afraid of anyone. But the feeling of being betrayed by someone he trusted wasn't like being stabbed. It was like the ground under his feet had suddenly vanished, and he was still standing, only he no longer knew what he was standing on. He picked up the envelope, locked it inside a drawer in his office, then walked out the door. "Tommy, drive." "Where to, Mr. Vince?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said 2 words Tommy had never heard him say in 8 years of working beside him. Anywhere at all. The black Escalade moved along Lake Shore Drive, passing skyscrapers glittering beneath the autumn sun. Vince sat in the back seat, staring out the window without seeing anything. When the car reached Grant Park, he told Tommy to stop. Tommy pulled over. Vince stepped out, didn't say another word, and walked straight into the park, found an empty stone bench, and sat down. He pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, only to have something in his hand, to look normal, to avoid looking like a man who had just discovered he was being surrounded from the inside. The autumn afternoon light poured across the park, golden and warm, the kind of light ordinary people would have called beautiful. Vince didn't see any of it. He just sat there, alone, in the middle of his city, and for the first time in 8 years, he didn't know what the next move was. Then she appeared. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't see anyone coming closer. He only knew that suddenly someone sat down beside him on the stone bench, so lightly it was almost weightless. He glanced to the side. It was her, the woman with messy hair, a gray hoodie, and shoes split open at the toes. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the pigeons in front of her, tilting her head as if she were listening to them talk. His instincts went on alert immediately. Who sent her? A trap? Was someone watching? He swept his gaze around the park, but there was nothing unusual. No one suspicious. Only joggers, a few couples out for a walk, and the pigeons. He looked back at her. She was still watching the pigeons, her lips moving slightly as though she were whispering to them. And he realized, slowly and against his own will, that she wasn't a threat. She was only a woman sitting on a stone bench in the park on an autumn afternoon, talking to pigeons, and he had happened to sit beside her. Or she had happened to sit beside him. He didn't know which was true, but he didn't get up and walk away. And that was the first thing Vince Carano couldn't explain that day. She pointed at the fattest pigeon in the flock, the one standing right in front of the stone bench, tilting its head at the two of them as if it were waiting for something. "That one is Gerald," she said, her voice soft but clear, as though she were introducing an old friend. "Gerald likes to steal food from the others, but I don't get mad at Gerald. Gerald is funny." Vince said nothing. He just sat there, watching her talk to the pigeons with the seriousness of someone having the most important conversation of the day. She told him the little pigeon on the left was named Pickle, because it waddled like a pickle rolling down a hill. The one standing alone in the far right corner was named Susan, because it looked like a Susan. He didn't understand her logic for naming them, but he realized something as he sat there listening to her speak. She wasn't completely crazy. The things she said had structure, had a thread, even carried a strange kind of humor inside them. But she wasn't entirely well either. Sometimes her eyes drifted away, staring into empty space as if she were seeing something Vince couldn't see. Then they would come back, and she would smile at Gerald and go on, talking as if nothing had happened. She existed somewhere in between, in that place where reality and her private world overlapped, where the line was so blurred that she herself probably couldn't tell the difference anymore. "Where do you stay?" Vince asked, his voice low and careful, the kind of voice he hadn't used with anyone in 8 years. She tilted her head and thought for a long moment, as if the question were more complicated than he realized. "I'm here," she said. "This bench is my home. The pigeons are my friends. Last night it rained hard, so I sat under that awning across the street. Gerald hid too. Gerald only came back this morning." She said it the way someone might talk about the weather, without complaining, without asking for pity, simply stating the truth with such calm that Vince felt something in his chest tighten. He pulled out his phone and texted Tommy, "Bring food in. Anything you can buy nearby." 5 minutes later, Tommy came into the park carrying a paper bag with 2 grilled chicken sandwiches, a bottle of orange juice, and a cup of hot coffee. He set the bag on the bench beside Vince, glanced at the woman, then looked at Vince with a question in his eyes. He didn't need to speak aloud. Vince gave the slightest shake of his head, meaning, "Go." Tommy returned to the car. Vince pushed the bag toward her. "Eat." She looked at the paper bag, then at him, then back at the bag. She pulled out one sandwich with one hand. The other still held tightly to the dirty cloth bag in her lap, never letting go, as if the most important thing in her life would disappear the second she did. She ate slowly, small bites, careful bites, the way people ate when they were used to not knowing whether there would be another meal after this one. Vince sat beside her, not eating, only watching her, and he realized he had forgotten about the anonymous envelope, forgotten about Renata, forgotten about the empire under threat. For those few minutes, he was only a man, sitting on a stone bench, watching a strange woman eat a sandwich and talk to pigeons, and he didn't want to be anywhere else. She had eaten half the sandwich when she stopped. She looked at him with those eyes that moved between clarity and haze, but in this exact moment they were strangely clear. "Are you sad?" she asked. "You look very sad." Vince didn't answer right away. He was the man this entire city feared, the man no one ever dared ask how he felt. And now a homeless girl was eating his sandwich in the park and asking him whether he was sad, in the most sincere voice he had heard in years. "Someone is trying to take everything from me," he said. He didn't understand why he told the truth, but he had. She nodded slowly, seriously, as if he had just entrusted her with a great secret, and she was keeping it safe. "I know that feeling," she said. "They already took everything from me." She paused and looked down at the pigeons. "But they didn't take Gerald." Vince looked at her, looked at the fat pigeon pecking at breadcrumbs on the ground, and he didn't know how to react, because for the first time in his life, he felt that someone with nothing was comforting someone who had everything. She turned to him, her eyes clear, her head tilted slightly. "Do you want me to pray for you?" Vince Carano, a man who didn't believe in God, didn't believe in miracles, didn't believe in anything he couldn't control with money or fear, sat on that stone bench looking at that girl and didn't say no. He didn't say no. But he didn't say yes either. He just sat there in silence, and she took that as agreement. She closed her eyes, both thin hands resting on the cloth bag in her lap, her lips moving for a few seconds. The prayer was so short that Vince didn't catch all of it. Only a few scattered words. "Keep him safe, and please let me find my daughter again." Then she opened her eyes, looked at him, and gave a small nod as if she had just completed an important task. "It's done," she said. Vince looked down at the dirty cloth bag she had held tightly ever since he met her, never letting it go for even a second. Even while eating, even while praying, her hand had still been touching it. "What's in that bag that you've got such a tight hold on?" he asked. She paused, looked at the bag, then at him, then at the bag again. Her expression changed in that moment, from vague to clear, from distracted to serious, as if the bag were a switch that pulled her back into reality every time she drifted too far away. She opened it slowly, each movement careful and gentle, the way people opened a box that held the most precious thing they had. Inside that worn and frayed cloth bag were 3 things: a faded Polaroid photograph, its corners bent, its surface scratched. In the photograph was a newborn baby, eyes closed, face red and wrinkled, wrapped in a white hospital blanket. A cheap silver necklace with a small cross, exactly like the one tied around her wrist, except this one was a little newer, as if it had been kept away and rarely used. And a piece of paper folded into quarters, its edges yellowed and worn, with a line written in blue ballpoint pen, shaky but trying to be clear. "Ellie, 3.2 kilograms, 7:14 in the morning." She took out the Polaroid and held it with both hands, raising it for him to see. She didn't hand it over completely, only lifted it in front of him, close enough for him to see but far enough that she still kept hold of it. "This is Ellie," she said, and her voice changed completely, no longer distracted, no longer talking to pigeons. Her voice now was the voice of a mother, and no matter if the world saw her as crazy, as homeless, as someone with nothing left, that voice was never crazy. "My daughter," she said. She looked at the photograph with a gaze Vince had never seen anyone give anything before. It wasn't the look of someone staring at a picture. It was the look of someone staring at the person they loved most in the world and weren't allowed to touch. "They took my daughter," she continued, her voice holding no anger, no bitterness, only the bare truth of something that had happened and that she hadn't had the strength to stop. "They said I wasn't fit. No home, no money, not stable. They took my daughter away." She paused, her finger brushing lightly across the face of the photograph, touching the baby's face inside it. "But one day I'll find her again," she said. "I promised her I would. The day they took her away, I told her that Mommy would come back. She was so little, she probably couldn't hear me. But I still said it, because if I didn't say it, then no one would tell her that there was someone in this world who loved her." Vince sat motionless. He looked at the faded photograph, looked at the face of the newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket, looked at the trembling writing on the scrap of paper. 3.2 kilograms, 7:14 in the morning. Someone had written down the moment the child entered the world with the precision of a person who wanted to remember forever, who wanted proof that their baby was real, that they had once been a mother, even if the world denied it. He didn't know why something in his chest twisted. It wasn't the kind of pain brought by the anonymous envelope that morning, not the kind of pain betrayal caused. This was something else, something older, deeper, like a wound that had healed long ago but had suddenly been touched in exactly the right place, reminding him that it was still there, that it had never truly healed at all. He looked at the photograph one more time, the baby's face, the closed eyes, the handwritten note, and something in his mind began to knock, softly at first, but insistently, at a room in his memory that he had locked shut 8 years ago and sworn he would never open again. but that door was shaking now, and Vince Carano, even though he didn't know it yet, even though he didn't understand, even though he wasn't ready, was about to open it. Because the faded Polaroid photograph in the hands of a homeless girl on a stone bench in a Chicago park was about to pull him into a truth he had been running from for 8 years. And this time, he couldn't run anymore. She had just put the photograph back into the cloth bag when a voice rang out from the other side of the park, breathless and urgent, like someone who had run a long way. Madeline. Dear God, Madeline. An older woman was hurrying across the grass, her steps unsteady, one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes red. She wore an old knitted coat, her silver hair pinned up high but half fallen loose, and her flat shoes were streaked with mud, as if she had been walking a great deal for many days. The moment she saw the girl on the stone bench, her face broke open with relief and pain all at once. You're here. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees in front of her, both hands gripping her shoulders. Maddie looked at her, tilted her head, then smiled. Miss Dot, did you come to visit me and Gerald? Vince rose to his feet. He looked at the older woman, then at the girl, then back at her. You know her? She turned toward him, her eyes still wet, her breathing not yet steady. I do, sir. I'm Dorothy Myers, her old neighbor from the boarding house on the south side. She stood up and wiped her tears with her sleeve, her voice trembling but trying to stay calm in the way of people who had lived through too much and knew crying solved nothing. Her real name is Madeline Grace Lawson, she said. She wasn't always like this. She used to be normal, sir. Smart, hard-working. She worked as a waitress in a little diner, supported herself, bothered no one. She looked down at Maddie, who was now sitting quietly on the bench, stroking the cloth bag, her eyes already drifting back toward the pigeons. About 3 years ago, everything collapsed. Miss Dot went on. She lost her job. The owner shut the diner down without warning. She couldn't pay the rent, and the landlord gave her 1 week, then threw her out. She went to a shelter over on Halsted Street, stayed there for a few months, then got thrown out of there too, because one night she started screaming in the middle of the night and frightened everybody. After that, she was out on the street. Miss Dot stopped and drew in a deep breath, as if the next part was harder to say. But the thing that truly shattered her wasn't losing the job, wasn't losing the roof over her head. She looked Vince straight in the eye, and there was something solemn and sorrowful in her face. She had a daughter, a baby girl. Vince didn't move, but he felt something in his chest tighten. When she ended up on the street, Child Protective Services came, Miss Dot said, her voice dropping lower. DCFS. They said she wasn't fit to raise her child. No home, no income, mentally unstable. They took the baby away. She wiped her tears again. She begged them. You can't imagine how she begged. I stood right there. I watched it happen, and I couldn't do a thing. They carried that baby off, and she fell to her knees on the sidewalk and screamed until she had no voice left. From that day on, she was never herself again. She looked down at Maddie. Maddie was bending over now, tearing the last bits of bread from the sandwich into tiny pieces, tossing them to Gerald and the pigeons, whispering something only she and the birds could hear. I've been looking for her for weeks, Miss Dot said. People told me they'd seen her around this park. I've walked through here every day, searching, and never found her. But today, dear God, today I found her. Vince stood there listening. He didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. He looked at the girl on the stone bench, the girl who only minutes ago had been naming pigeons and asking him whether he was sad, and now he knew she hadn't been born this way. Something, or someone, had broken her until she could no longer recognize the real world. And the daughter she had spoken of, the baby in the Polaroid, the baby named Ellie, 3.2 kilograms, 7:14 in the morning, the baby whose birth note she still kept inside that frayed bag, as if it were the last thing proving she had once been somebody. Where was that child now? Who was raising her? And did she know that her mother was sitting in a park talking to pigeons? He didn't know why this story made it hard for him to breathe. He had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with the baby. But there was something in everything Miss Dot had just said the name. The hauntingly familiar way the girl tilted her head, the South Side boarding house, the girl who had once worked as a waitress that was knocking against the locked door of the memory he had sealed shut 8 years ago. The knocking was getting louder, and Vince Carano began to feel something he hated, even more than betrayal. He began to feel afraid. He pulled out his phone, about to call Tommy and tell him to drive in. take this girl to the nearest hospital, and then he would handle everything the way he always handled things. Fast, clean, efficient, with no personal entanglement. But before pressing the number, he turned to Miss Dot and asked a question he himself didn't understand why he was asking. What is her full name? Miss Dot looked at him, a little surprised, but still answered. Madeline Grace Lawson. Vince's finger went rigid on the screen of his phone. He didn't press, didn't swipe, didn't do anything. He only stood there with the name having just struck the center of his chest like a bullet he had thought he had dodged long ago. Madeline Grace Lawson. 8 years. He hadn't heard that name in 8 years. For 8 years he had shoved it into the deepest drawer of his memory, locked it shut, buried it under money, power, blood, under all the things the road he had chosen had brought him. And now that name had come back. Not in a dream, not in a drunken flashback, but right here, in the middle of Grant Park, beneath the Chicago autumn sun, from the mouth of a crying old woman. 8 years earlier, Vincent Carano was 29 years old and had nothing. No money, no steady profession, no future he could see. He lived in a miserable rented room on the south side, the kind of room where the walls were so thin you could hear the person next door breathing. And the room beside his was Maddie's. Madeline Grace Lawson, 20 years old, working as a waitress in the little diner at the end of the street. She laughed often, the kind of laugh that didn't need a reason. Laughing because the weather was beautiful. Laughing because she had managed to cook dinner without burning it. Laughing because she saw the stray cat outside the window lying on its back with its belly in the sun. She used to hum softly while doing laundry in the shared hallway, always getting the words wrong, always off key, and never knowing she was singing it wrong. They began with conversations through half-open doors, then with shared dinners because cooking one portion cost as much as cooking two, then with nights sitting on the steps of the fire escape, looking down into the filthy alley, splitting cheap cans of beer, and talking about all the things neither of them had but both wanted. Then, with nights when the distance between their 2 rooming house doors stopped meaning anything at all. 6 months. 6 months that later, no matter how many buildings he owned, how many bank accounts he held, how many people had to bow their heads before him, he still knew those had been the happiest 6 months of his life. Then Sal Mancini appeared, the old boss on the west side, the man who needed a new soldier, young, reckless, unafraid of death, and with nothing to lose. Vince fit all 4 requirements. Mancini made the offer. Vince accepted. He told Maddie he had an opportunity, that he had to go, that it would be quick, a few weeks, a few months at most, and then he'd come back for her. He'd get her out of that room with the paper-thin walls. He'd give her the life she deserved. He promised. He looked into her eyes and promised. Then he left. The first week, he still called. The second week, he got busy. The first month, he told himself he'd call tomorrow. The second month, he changed his phone number because Mancini required it. The third month, he changed addresses. By the 6th month, he had killed his first man and was no longer Vincent from the South Side rooming house anymore. He became Vince Carano, and Madeline Grace Lawson became a name in a locked drawer, buried under layers and layers of violence and ambition, so deep he thought he had forgotten. He hadn't forgotten. He had only become very good at pretending. Standing in the middle of Grant Park, his phone still in his hand, Vince looked at the girl on the stone bench. She was tearing up the last bit of bread and dropping it for Gerald, whispering something under her breath, and he asked, his voice dry, cracked, like a man who hadn't had water in days. "Does she have a small crescent-shaped scar on her left shoulder blade?" Miss Dot turned and stared at him, her eyes widening. Silence for 1 second. 2. Then she spoke, slowly, word by word. "Yes. Do you know her?" Vince didn't answer. He looked at Maddie. She was smiling at Gerald, tilting her head, saying something only she and the pigeon could hear. She didn't recognize him. She didn't know that the man who had just bought her a sandwich, the man standing 3 steps away from her in a Chicago park, was the very man who had promised to come back 8 years ago. The very man who hadn't come back. The very man who, if he had stayed, might have kept her from ever ending up on a park bench, talking to pigeons, and clutching her daughter's photograph inside a frayed cloth bag, as if it were the last thing left from a life someone had stripped away without even looking. Back. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, turned to Miss Dot, and spoke in a voice that wasn't a suggestion, but a decision. "I'm taking her to the hospital. Northwestern Memorial." Miss Dot looked at him, then at Maddie, then back at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who had lived long enough to know that not every man in an expensive suit could be trusted, but who was also tired enough to know she had no other choice left. "Who are you to help her?" she asked, her voice not harsh, but cautious. Vince didn't answer right away. He couldn't say I was someone she used to know. He couldn't say I was the man who ruined her life. He only said, "I'll take care of her. You can trust me." Miss Dot hadn't even had the chance to respond when Maddie lifted her head from the stone bench, looked at the two of them, and said in that feather-light voice she used when she was somewhere between waking and dreaming, "He's not bad, Miss Dot. His eyes look like someone I used to know." Both Vince and Miss Dot went silent. Vince because those words went straight through his chest. Miss Dot because she saw something in the man's eyes that she couldn't explain, but it was enough to make her nod slowly. She bent down, wrapped an arm around Maddie's shoulders, and whispered a few words into her ear that Vince couldn't quite hear. Then she stood, looked at him one last time, and said, "Take care of her." Then she turned and walked away, slowly, her back slightly bent, crossing the grass along the same path she had come. Vince texted Tommy to bring the car around. The black Escalade pulled up beside the walkway. Tommy opened the back door, looked at Maddie, looked at Vince, and didn't ask a thing. He had worked with Vince long enough to know when to ask questions and when to stay quiet. This was a time to stay quiet. Maddie climbed into the car with the wonder of a child seeing something new for the first time. She ran her hand over the leather seat, looked around the spacious cabin, then turned toward the window. "Northwestern Memorial," Vince said to Tommy. Tommy nodded and pulled back onto the street. Maddie sat in the back seat beside Vince, the cloth bag resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. The car moved along Michigan Avenue as the streetlights began to flicker on in the deepening dusk. "1," she said suddenly. Vince turned to look at her. "2," she continued, pointing at the next streetlight slipping past the glass. 3, 4, she was counting the lights. "Do you know this game?" she asked, still staring outside. "I play it every night. Whoever counts more wins. But I play alone, so I always win." She laughed softly, that small laugh of hers, laughing even when nothing was funny, as if that was how she survived each day. Vince looked at her, then looked out the window. One more streetlight slid by. 5, he said. Maddie turned to him, her eyes widening, then smiled. A real smile. A wide smile. A smile as if someone had just given her something she had never expected to receive. 6, she said quickly, pointing to the next light. 7, he answered. They counted. The Mafia boss of Chicago sat in a bulletproof Escalade, counting streetlights with a homeless girl whose mind had come loose from itself. A girl clutching a frayed cloth bag in her lap, and for the first time on a day when he had discovered betrayal, discovered that the past had come back, discovered that he had ruined someone's life. For the first time in the middle of all of that, he felt something that came close to peace. Tommy glanced at them through the rearview mirror. His eyes flickered once, but he said nothing. They had counted to 23 when Vince's phone vibrated. The screen lit up with the name Knox Harrigan. He looked at the name for 1 second, then answered. Knox's voice was stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. "Vince, Renata just walked into the notary office on LaSalle Street. She filed a petition declaring you mentally incompetent. Frankie DeMarco signed as a witness. They've got a doctor's certification. I checked. The doctor is fake. The medical license doesn't exist. But on paper it looks real, Vince. Very real. If you don't act within 24 hours, she'll have temporary control over all your assets and the company. Everything." Vince listened without interrupting, without asking him to repeat anything. When Knox finished, he stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then he ended the call. He didn't say, "I understand." He didn't say, "Handle it." He only hung up. 24 hours. On one front, the woman he had abandoned 8 years ago was sitting beside him, counting streetlights, not recognizing him, and perhaps never able to forgive him if she ever did. On the other front, the woman he had trusted for the past 2 years was trying to strip away everything he had built. Maddie looked at him and tilted her head. 24, she said, pointing out the window. "I'm winning." Vince Carano sat between those two worlds inside the black Escalade, moving through the streets of Chicago at dusk, and for the first time in 8 years, he didn't know what the next move was. The Escalade pulled up in front of the emergency entrance of Northwestern Memorial Hospital just as night had fully fallen. Tommy opened the door. Vince stepped out first, then turned back and held out his hand to Maddie. She looked at his hand for a moment, then took it and stepped out of the car, her cloth bag clutched tightly in her other hand. The two of them walked into the emergency lobby side by side, a black three-piece suit tailored to the body beside a torn gray hoodie, polished leather shoes beside split-open sneakers, and every eye in the waiting room turned toward them. The receptionist, the patients waiting in chairs, the nurses passing by. Everyone looked, and no one understood. Vince didn't look back at a single one of them. He walked straight to the front desk and gave the name of the doctor he had texted Knox to call before they arrived. 10 minutes later, Dr. Cora Whitfield appeared. She was about 45, with short hair, sharp eyes, but a gentle voice. The kind of doctor who had seen too many heartbreaking cases and still hadn't gone completely numb. She looked at Maddie, looked at Vince, then looked at Maddie again. She led them into a private exam room and asked Maddie to sit on the hospital bed. Maddie obeyed quietly, her eyes moving around the room, studying each piece of medical equipment with open curiosity. "This room is prettier than my home," she said to Vince, in a voice that was completely serious. Dr. Whitfield examined her for about 20 minutes, asked Maddie a series of questions, observed her reactions, and took notes. Maddie answered some questions clearly, answered some by wandering off into Gerald and the pigeons, and for some she only sat in silence staring at the wall. After that, the doctor stepped outside to speak with Vince in the hallway. At first glance, she shows signs of a mild psychotic disorder, combined with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, Dr. Whitfield said. She's clearly malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of a mild infection in her foot, probably from walking around in torn shoes for too long. She needs to be admitted. She needs treatment for both her body and her mind, not for a few days, but possibly for a few weeks. She paused and looked at Vince. "Does she have health insurance?" Vince pulled the black Amex card from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed it in the doctor's hand. "No limit. The best room. The best doctors. Do whatever needs to be done." Dr. Whitfield looked at the card, then looked at him with the expression he had seen many times in his life, the expression of someone trying to read who the man standing in front of them really was. "Are you family?" Vince was silent for 1 second. Then he answered, his voice low, each word heavier than the last. "I'm the man who owes her a lifetime." Dr. Whitfield didn't ask another question. She nodded, took the card, and went back inside to arrange the room. 15 minutes later, a nurse brought Maddie up to a private room on the 6th floor, a room with a window overlooking the city streets, clean, quiet, nothing like the places she had slept for the past 3 years. Maddie sat on the hospital bed and looked around, running her hand over the white sheets. "So soft," she whispered, almost under her breath. The nurse prepared an IV and a sedative. Before the needle went into her arm, Maddie turned and looked at Vince, who was standing beside the door. "Will you be here when I wake up?" Her voice didn't beg. It didn't tremble with fear. She was only asking, calmly, the way someone might ask whether it would rain tomorrow. But behind that question was the whole life of someone who had watched everyone leave. "Everyone leaves," she added, even softer. "Gerald leaves too when it rains." Vince walked to the bedside. He looked at her, and he said 2 words that in 8 years he hadn't said to anyone and meant, "I'm here." The medicine began to work. Maddie's eyes grew heavier. But before they closed completely, she reached for his hand with her thin, fragile fingers and held on tightly. "Dear God," she whispered, her eyes almost shut. "I don't know who this man is, but he doesn't look at me like I'm trash. He counted streetlights with me. Please keep him safe. And please let me see Ellie again. Amen." Her hand loosened. She fell asleep. Vince stood beside the bed for another minute, looking at her face in sleep, the face he had once seen every morning when he woke up 8 years ago. Thinner now, paler now, but still that same face. He stepped out into the hallway, leaned back against the wall, and closed his eyes. His eyes burned, not the kind of burning from cigarette smoke or cold wind, the kind of burning he hadn't felt in 8 years, the kind he had thought he had killed long ago along with everything human inside himself. His phone vibrated. "Neil Ashford," he answered. "Vince." Neil's voice was fast, sharp, the voice of a lawyer who could smell victory. Renata made a fatal mistake. Her witness, Frankie DeMarco, has a fraud conviction in Nevada that she never checked, and the seal on the doctor's paperwork belongs to a clinic that lost its license 6 months ago. The entire filing she submitted to the court will be thrown out if we challenge it right now. Do you want me to move? Vince opened his eyes and looked through the small glass window in the door of the hospital room. Maddie was asleep, one hand still resting on the cloth bag. Not yet, he said. Let her come. I want to see her face when she realizes she's already lost. Neil was silent for a second, then said, Understood. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and went back to stand in the hallway, leaning against the wall, staring at the door to the hospital room. Inside, the girl whose life he had shattered was sleeping for the first time in 3 years on clean sheets, after whispering a short prayer asking God to keep him safe. And outside that room, the woman trying to steal everything he had didn't yet know that the prayer had already been answered even sooner than the girl who prayed it could have imagined. He didn't have to wait long. Renata Voss stepped into the 6th-floor hallway when it was fully dark outside the hospital windows, her high heels striking the granite floor in a steady rhythm like a countdown clock. She was tall, straight-backed, with black hair falling to her shoulders, red lipstick without a single smear, and a beige Birkin hanging from the crook of her arm, with the ease of someone who carried it every day without ever thinking about the price. Behind her was a middle-aged man in a gray suit, a black leather briefcase in hand, walking with the professional confidence of an attorney who billed by the hour. Renata had found out Vince was at the hospital through Frankie, or through someone connected to Frankie, and she hadn't come because she was worried about anyone's health. She had come with a prepared file, a clear plan, to force Vince to sign while he wasn't ready, while he was in a place where he had no advantage, while he had no lawyer beside him. She stopped the moment she saw them. Vince was sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, his back against the wall, and Maddie was sitting beside him. She had slipped out of her hospital room without anyone noticing, probably waking up and panicking when she didn't see him there, then going to look for him, finding him in the hallway, sitting down beside him, and falling asleep with her head resting on his shoulder. The cloth bag was still in her lap. The cross necklace glimmered faintly beneath the fluorescent lights. Renata's face changed, not much, only just enough for Vince to notice. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed for half a second. Her nose wrinkled in a quick motion, as though she had just caught the smell of something unpleasant. What is this? Renata said, her voice low but sharp. You're sitting with a homeless thing in a hospital? Vince didn't move. He didn't get up. He didn't shift his posture. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, and when he slowly turned to look at Renata, it was the look that people who had once sat across from him in windowless rooms knew well. The look that came before everything ended. Keep your voice down, he said. She's sleeping. Renata dismissed that the way she dismissed background noise. She stepped closer, the lawyer following behind her, opened the briefcase, and took out a stack of papers. Vince, this is serious. The company's legal situation is extremely complicated, and you need to sign these papers today. If you don't sign, the court will freeze the assets tomorrow morning. She extended the documents toward him. Her voice was calm, professional. The voice of the lawyer she was. The voice trained to make people sign things they should never sign. Vince looked at the papers. Then he looked up at Renata's face, and he spoke slowly, one word at a time, each word falling into the quiet hospital hallway, like the strike of a hammer. Renata, I know everything. Her eyes blinked, once, fast, but enough for him to see it. I know about Frankie DeMarco. I know he signed as your witness. I know the doctor's certification is fake, and that clinic's seal was revoked 6 months ago. I know about the offshore account you opened using money transferred from my company. I have copies of everything. The messages, the photographs, the transfer receipts. Neil Ashford is holding all of it. Renata stood motionless, the papers in her hand lowered half an inch, unconsciously, as though their weight had suddenly grown heavier. The lawyer behind her looked down at the floor. You've got 60 seconds, Vince said, his voice flat, emotionless, still as water before a storm. If you turn around and walk out of this hallway right now, and never show your face to me again, it ends here. If you stand here 1 second longer trying to force me to sign anything, Neil will send the entire file to the media and to civil court before midnight. Your legal career will end, not pause, end, silence. Renata's mask didn't shatter all at once. It cracked slowly. From the faint twitch at the corner of her eye, to the way her red lips pressed together, to the hand holding the papers beginning to shake so slightly it was almost invisible. She was trying to hold it together, trying to calculate whether there was still any way out, but Vince's eyes told her there wasn't. The lawyer touched Renata lightly on the elbow and leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Renata jerked her arm away from him. She looked down at Maddie, who was still asleep against Vince's shoulder, her tangled hair spilling across the shoulder of his black suit jacket, her split-open shoes sticking out beneath the hem of the hospital pants the nurse had changed her into. Renata laughed, the kind of laugh that held nothing funny. All this for a crazy woman? The hallway went still, and then Maddie's voice rose, soft, hoarse, still heavy with sleep, but every word clear. I'm not crazy. She opened her eyes slowly and looked straight at Renata, with eyes that 10 minutes earlier had been clouded and lost. But in this moment, in this exact moment, were so clear it was frightening. I've just been sad for too long. The 6th floor hallway of Northwestern Memorial Hospital froze in place. The nurse pushing a medication cart past them stopped. Renata's lawyer lowered his head even further, and Renata stood there looking at the tangled-haired girl in a hospital gown leaning against the shoulder of the Chicago Mafia boss. And for the first time in her carefully calculated life, Renata Voss had nothing to say. She turned away. Her lawyer followed. Her heels struck the granite floor again, but this time faster, no longer steady. Vince watched until both of them disappeared at the far end of the hallway, then said, not loudly, because he didn't need to be loud, because he knew she would still hear him. Go, don't come back. After Renata disappeared at the end of the hallway, Vince remained sitting there in silence for a long time. Maddie had fallen asleep again, her head still resting on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even. He gently helped her up, called a nurse to take her back to her room, waited until she was lying still in bed and the cloth bag had been placed beside her pillow. Then he left the hospital, got into the car, and called Knox Harrigan. I need you to find out everything about Madeline Grace Lawson. Everything. From 8 years ago until now. Don't miss a thing. Knox didn't ask why. He only said, give me a few hours. Vince went back to the penthouse, didn't turn on the lights, didn't eat, and sat in his office staring out the glass wall. Chicago at night stretched beneath him like a map made of light, and he looked at it without seeing anything. At 2 a.m, his phone vibrated. Knox sent over a heavy file by email. Vince opened it, and for the next 2 hours, he read the life of Madeline Grace Lawson from the day after he left, page by page, line by line, as if he were reading an indictment written against himself. After Vince disappeared, Maddie discovered she was pregnant about 6 weeks later. She called his phone number. The number had been disconnected. She went to his old rented room. Someone else was living there. She asked the landlord. The landlord said he didn't know where Vince had gone, that he hadn't left an address, hadn't left anything. She asked the few people they both knew around the South Side. No one knew. Vincent Carano vanished from her life so cleanly, it was as if he had never existed at all. She carried the pregnancy alone. She kept waitressing until the 7th month, when her belly grew too large to carry trays, and the diner let her go. She gave birth at Cook County Hospital at 7:14 in the morning on a day in March, alone, with no one holding her hand, no one waiting outside the room. A baby girl, 3.2 kilograms. She named her Ellie. Vince stopped reading at that line. 7:14 in the morning. 3.2 kilograms. The handwritten note on the scrap of paper inside Maddie's cloth bag rose in his mind with such clarity, it was as if he were seeing it again. She had written down the moment her daughter came into the world with a ballpoint pen on a scrap of paper and kept it for 7 years inside that frayed bag, because it was all she had to prove that she had once been a mother. He kept reading. After Ellie was born, Maddie went back to work, found a job at another diner, with less pay and longer hours. Miss Dot helped watch Ellie while she worked. She lived that way for 4 years, struggling but managing to hold on. Then 3 years ago, the diner closed without warning. She lost her job. She couldn't find new work fast enough. The landlord gave her exactly 1 week, then threw her out. She carried Ellie out into the street. Mother and daughter slept at a shelter on Halsted Street for a few months. Then Maddie began having panic attacks in the middle of the night, screaming, crying, calling someone's name that no one at the shelter recognized. The shelter told her to leave. The two of them ended up living on the street, and then DCFS came. Knox had attached a copy of the DCFS file. Vince opened it. Inside was the report from the day they came to take Ellie. signed by the social worker, with notes describing Maddie's condition at the time. Mentally unstable, no fixed residence, no income, no family support, enough to justify temporarily removing custody of the child. The little girl was transferred to St. Francis Children's Home, a group home run by the Catholic Church in the western suburbs of Chicago. And at the end of the file, Knox had marked one page. It was a handwritten request from Maddie, submitted to DCFS on the day they took Ellie away. Plain white paper, the kind torn from a notebook, handwriting shaking, parts of it blurred, as if drops of water had fallen on it. Please give me one more day, just one day. I'll find work. I'll find a place to stay. Please don't take my daughter. My daughter's name is Ellie. She likes to draw. She's afraid to sleep in the dark. Please leave a light on for her if you take her away. Please tell her mommy will come back. Vince set the paper down on the desk. His hand was shaking. He reached for the bottle of Macallan on the shelf, poured a glass, but didn't drink it. The whiskey stood there on the desk, amber light trembling beneath the lamp, and he only stared at it. Then he looked back at the file, looked at Ellie's date of birth. March. Counted back 9 months. June of the year before. June 8 years ago. The last month he had spent in that South Side rooming house. The last month he had spent with Maddie. Everything collapsed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was only the truth falling into the office of the penthouse on the 42nd floor at 2 a.m, heavier than anything he had ever carried, and Vince Carano sat there alone with an untouched glass of whiskey. The handwritten plea of the woman he had abandoned, and the truth that, somewhere in this city, in a small house out in the suburbs, there was a 7-year-old child carrying his blood, asleep without knowing who her father was. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the office until the sky beyond the glass shifted from black to gray, then from gray to the pale orange of a Chicago dawn. The glass of whiskey still sat untouched on the desk. Maddie's handwritten plea was still there, the trembling lines blurred beneath the desk lamp. He read it 3 times during the night. Each time he read it, every line grew heavier than before. At 5 a.m, he stood, changed into a suit, washed his face, and called Knox. Bring Frankie DeMarco to the warehouse on the south side. 7 o'clock. Don't tell him why. Knox was silent for a second, then said, Understood. The warehouse stood in the old industrial district near Bridgeport, a red brick building from the 1940s that Vince had bought through a shell company 3 years earlier. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Rusted iron doors, weeds growing around the parking lot. Inside, it was one vast empty space with high ceilings, light slipping in through dusty glass windows. Knox arrived first, with 2 other men Vince didn't need to name because they were always there when needed, standing motionless in the dark corners as if they were part of the walls themselves. Vince arrived at 6:45, parked the Escalade outside, walked in, and stood in the middle of the warehouse with both hands in his trouser pockets, silent. Knox stood beside him, one hand holding an iPad containing every message exchanged between Frankie DeMarco and Renata Voss that he had extracted the night before. Frankie arrived exactly at 7. He drove a black Dodge Charger into the lot and stepped out with the confident swagger of a man who didn't yet know what he was walking into. 34 years old, hair slicked back with gel, brown leather jacket, a smile he thought was charming but was really only the smile of a man no one had ever looked in the eye and told the truth to. Frankie walked into the warehouse, saw Vince, saw Knox, saw the 2 shadows in the dark corners, and half the smile vanished from his face. But he still tried to hold on to it. Vince, he said, his voice trying for ease. What is this? Calling me out so early? Vince didn't answer. He looked at Frankie, a long look, silent, the kind of look that made no one in the room dare breathe too hard. Then he said, his voice flat, neither rising nor falling, neither warm nor cold. Knox, read it. Knox turned on the iPad and began to read. Every message, 1 line at a time. The message Frankie sent Renata at 11 o'clock at night, 3 weeks earlier, asking if she had contacted the lawyer yet. Renata's reply at midnight, sending a photo of the forged paperwork draft. Frankie's messages giving Renata Vince's schedule, so she would know when he wasn't at the office. Frankie's message asking Renata when it would be finished, so he could collect his share. Frankie's share was 15%. 15% of Vince Carano's empire. That was the price Frankie DeMarco had placed on betrayal. Knox read all 12 messages. The warehouse stayed silent. Frankie stood there, and in the 30 seconds it took Knox to read the last lines, His face went through everything. It hardened, then went white, then his eyes widened, his mouth parted, and then he began to shake. Not his hands. The shaking started in his knees, the kind of shaking that came when a man realized that everything he had in this world, including the ability to walk out of this room on his own 2 legs, depended on the next sentence spoken by the man standing in front of him. "Vince, I can explain," Frankie said, his voice cracking. Vince lifted one hand, not to silence him, just raised it lightly, as if stopping a door from slamming shut, and Frankie fell quiet. "I don't need your explanation," Vince said. "I need you gone from Chicago before tonight." Frankie swallowed hard, looked at Knox. Knox stared straight ahead, expressionless. Looked at the 2 shadows in the corner. The 2 shadows didn't move. "If I hear your name in this city tomorrow morning," Vince said, his voice still flat, still without rise or fall, "then it won't be my fault anymore." Frankie didn't say another word. He turned, walked out of the warehouse on legs he was trying to stop from shaking and couldn't, climbed into the car, started the engine, and drove away. Knox watched the Dodge Charger disappear at the end of the road, then turned to Vince. "It's done," Knox said. "He won't come back." Vince nodded. Renata had lost her inside man, lost her witness, lost her most important piece on the board. Everything she had built over months collapsed in a single morning, and she didn't even know it yet. But Vince wasn't thinking about Renata, wasn't thinking about Frankie, wasn't thinking about the empire, about money, about power. He was thinking about the handwritten plea on the penthouse desk at 2 a.m. "Please don't take my daughter. She's afraid to sleep in the dark." He walked out of the warehouse without another word to Knox, got into the Escalade, and this time he drove himself, alone. No Tommy, no bodyguards, no one. He drove west, out of the city, toward the suburbs, toward an address Google Maps had shown him, an address he had stared at all night long in the DCFS file, St. Francis Children's Home. St. Francis Children's Home stood at the end of a quiet road in the western suburbs of Chicago, the kind of road lined on both sides with single-story houses that had front yards and neighbors who knew one another by name. The house was a little larger than the others nearby. 2 stories, white brick, gray roof, a white wooden fence surrounding a small grassy yard, with a swing set and a plastic slide faded by the sun. It looked more like an ordinary home than a place that cared for abandoned children. And perhaps that was the point, so the children inside would feel as though they were living in a home and not in an institution. Vince parked the black Escalade in front of the gate and sat in the car for a long while. He had built an empire from nothing, had faced men who wanted him dead, had sat in rooms where only one man was meant to walk out alive, and never once had it been this hard to step out of a car. He got out, walked through the gate, and rang the bell. The woman who opened the door was about 55, with short gray hair and a kind but sturdy face, the face of someone who had spent her whole life caring for other people's children and had learned how to read a person in the first 3 seconds. She wore a white blouse, and around her neck hung a small cross. Sister Margaret Brennan. She looked Vince up and down. Black suit, leather shoes, a bulletproof Escalade parked outside the gate of a children's home in the suburbs. Her eyes weren't afraid, but they were cautious. The caution of someone whose duty was to protect children no one else had protected. "How can I help you?" "I want to see Ellie Lawson," Vince said. She didn't react immediately. She kept looking at him for several more seconds, assessing him. "Who are you?" Vince opened his mouth, then stopped. He had prepared an answer during the drive over. He had meant to say he was a family acquaintance. He had meant to say he was someone who wanted to offer financial support. But standing in front of this woman, in the front yard of a house where children's laughter drifted out from inside, he couldn't say any of those things. "I think I'm her father," he said. Sister Margaret looked at him for a long time, not with the surprise he had expected. She had probably heard many people say that sentence before, and she knew that some told the truth and some lied, and the only way to tell the difference was to look into their eyes while they said it. She looked into Vince's eyes. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in." She led him through a small, spotless living room with children's drawings hanging on the walls, down a hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and cookies, into a common room at the back of the house. There were about 6 or 7 children in the room, different ages, playing, reading, watching television, and in the corner of the room, sitting alone at a small table near the window, was a little girl. 7 years old, long brown hair tied in a slightly crooked ponytail, wearing a pink t-shirt and jeans, drawing. Vince stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, and everything inside him stopped with it, because of the eyes. Black, large, round eyes lowered over the sheet of paper, with a concentration he recognized immediately, because he saw those eyes in the mirror every day. The forehead, the nose, the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she focused, exactly the way he tilted his own head when reading documents. He gripped the back of the nearest chair because his knees no longer felt steady. Sister Margaret said gently, "Ellie, someone would like to meet you." The girl looked up, looked at Sister Margaret, then at Vince. She wasn't afraid. She didn't shrink back. She only looked, with those wide black eyes, with the calm curiosity of a child who was used to strangers coming and going. "Hello, sir," she said politely. Vince walked toward her, slowly, one step at a time, as if the floor might collapse beneath him at any moment. He looked down at the picture she was drawing. Crayon. A house. Red roof, yellow walls, windows with curtains. In front of the house were 3 people, one tall, one shorter, and one tiny in the middle holding both their hands. "What are you drawing?" he asked, and his own voice sounded so strange that he barely recognized it. "My house," she said, pointing at the picture with her finger. "But I don't have a real house yet. This is the house I want." She pointed to the 3 people in the drawing. "This is Mommy. This is me. And this is Daddy. I don't have a real daddy yet either. But Sister Margaret says if I pray enough, God will send one." Vince went down onto his knees. Both knees touched the floor, bringing him level with her eyes, exactly the kind of kneeling he had never once imagined himself doing before anyone 8 years ago. "How do you pray?" he asked. She tilted her head to the left, thought for a moment, then answered in a serious voice, as if explaining something very important. "I say, Dear God, please send my mommy back to me, and if you can, please send my daddy too. I say it every night before I go to sleep. 1,247 times already." Vince looked at her. 1,247 times. "You counted?" "I'm very good at counting," she said, nodding firmly. "Sister Margaret taught me. I can count all the way to 10,000. But Sister Margaret says we probably won't need 10,000 because God listens very fast." Vince stayed there on his knees in front of a 7-year-old child with eyes exactly like his own. A child who had prayed for 1,247 nights in a row, asking God to send her a family, and he couldn't stand up. Not because his knees were weak, but because something heavier than gravity was pressing on his chest. Something that 8 years of power and violence had never prepared him to endure. It was the moment Vince Carano, the Mafia boss of Chicago, realized that the prayer of a 7-year-old girl he had never known was his daughter, carried more weight than any empire he had ever built. 5 days passed. Every day Vince came to the hospital and sat beside Maddie's bed, not saying much, only being there. On some days, she woke and talked to him about Gerald, about the pigeons, about the streetlight counting game. On some days, she slept the whole time, and he only sat reading the news beside her bed, listening to the steady sound of her breathing. On some days she woke, but her eyes were clouded, and she looked at him without recognizing him, called him sir, asked who he was, then fell asleep again. Dr. Whitfield said the medication was working, that Maddie's lucid moments were becoming longer, clearer. But she also warned him that when her memory truly came back in full, that would be the hardest moment, because remembering who she was would also mean remembering everything she had lost. On the 5th day, in the afternoon, Vince sat in the chair beside her bed, reading emails on his phone. The late afternoon sunlight came through the window and stretched across the floor of the hospital room in one long golden strip. Maddie was lying on her side, eyes closed, the cloth bag resting beside her pillow. He thought she was asleep. Then she opened her eyes. Slowly, she looked up at the ceiling, looked toward the window, looked at the stripe of sunlight on the floor, and finally, looked at him. She looked for a long time, a very long time. Not with the vague look of the previous days, the kind of look where her eyes drifted past him the way they drifted past a piece of furniture in the room. This time was different. Her eyes stopped on him, on his face, the line of his jaw, the bridge of his nose, the way he frowned when he read something on his phone. She looked at him as though she were fitting pieces together, slowly, one piece at a time, and with each piece falling into place, her eyes widened a little more. "Vincent?" He looked up. Not Vince, Not sir. Not you. Vincent. The full name only one person in the world had ever called him, in the hallway of the Southside boarding house, at midnight, when she knocked on his door and asked whether he wanted instant noodles because she had made too much. Vincent. He set the phone down. Their eyes met, and he saw the moment memory returned to her completely. It didn't come back slowly. It came all at once, like a door being kicked open, and everything behind it rushing through at the same time. Maddie's eyes changed. In the space of a few seconds, he saw every stage clearly. Surprise, then recognition, then pain, then anger, then devastation. Layer upon layer so quickly that her face couldn't keep up with it. Only her eyes could, and her eyes told the whole story. Vincent Carano, she said, her voice not trembling, not crying, only so clear it sounded cold. Room 4B, left hallway. You used to sing Wonderwall off-key in the shower, and you never admitted you sang it wrong. She remembered everything. He said nothing. He couldn't say anything. She sat up in the hospital bed slowly and leaned back against the raised headboard. Her eyes never left him. And when she spoke again, her voice was not the voice of the broken girl in the park, not the voice that talked to pigeons, not the blurred voice from those half-lucid days. This was the voice of Madeline Grace Lawson, 20 years old, standing in the hallway of a boarding house, staring at the closed door of room 4B day after day, knowing the man inside was never coming back. You left, she said. You said a few weeks. You said you'd come back and take me with you. I waited. 4 months I waited, Vincent. For 4 months I stood in that hallway looking at your door. Every time I heard footsteps on the stairs, I thought it was you. Not once was it you. She paused, took a breath. Then I found out I was pregnant, and I called you. The number didn't work anymore. I went to your room. Someone else was living there. I asked everybody. No one knew where you were. You disappeared, Vincent. Disappeared so completely, it was like you'd never existed. Vince sat in the chair, both hands resting on his thighs, and took every word she gave him. He didn't lower his head. He didn't look away. He looked straight at her because that was the bare minimum he owed her, to look directly into her eyes while she told him exactly how he had destroyed her life. I gave birth alone, she said. In the hospital. Alone. No one held my hand. No one stood outside the waiting room. I raised our daughter alone. For 4 years. Then I lost my job. Lost my home. Ended up on the street. And they took my daughter. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not loudly. Only a small fracture. But enough for Vince to hear everything behind it. They took my daughter, Vincent. She looked at him. Because you weren't there. 6 words. 6 words that weighed more than any bullet he had ever fired in 8 years. Because a bullet only kills once. Those 6 words would kill him every time he remembered them. And he knew he would remember them every day for the rest of his life. The hospital room fell silent after those 6 words. Vince sat in the chair. Maddie sat on the bed. And between them lay 8 years that no apology could ever be large enough to fill. He opened his mouth, but she spoke first. Do you know about Ellie? Her voice changed when she said that name. The anger was still there. The pain was still there. But something else pushed its way through. Something he recognized as fear. Fear of hearing the answer. Fear of knowing that he knew. Fear of knowing that he didn't. Both possibilities hurt the same. I only just found out, Vince said. His voice was low, slow. Each word placed carefully, as though he were stepping across a floor of glass that could shatter at any moment. I went to the children's home. I met her. Maddie looked at him. That look was no longer anger. No longer pain. It was the look of a mother waiting to hear about the child she wasn't allowed to see. And everything else in the world, including betrayal, including 8 years of suffering, stood in line behind the next question. Is she okay? 3 words. Her voice broke on the second, but she swallowed it back and kept the question whole, because she needed the answer more than she needed to cry. Vince looked at her, and he told her. He told her in a voice he had never used with anyone, a voice without concealment, without calculation, without control. She's okay, he said. She's living in a small, clean house. There's a playground there, a swing set. A woman named Sister Margaret is taking very good care of her. Maddie listened without blinking, both hands gripping the bedsheet. He went on. She draws. Every day she sits at a little table by the window and draws. The day I went. She was drawing a house. Red roof, yellow walls, windows with curtains. In front of the house there were 3 people. She pointed to the picture and said, "This is Mommy, this is me, and this is Daddy." Maddie lifted a hand and covered her mouth. Not because she wanted to hold back the sound of crying, but because something larger than crying was rising inside her chest, and she didn't know what form it would take if she let it out. He didn't stop. Because she needed to hear it, and he owed her that. She said she doesn't have a real family yet, but Sister Margaret told her that if she prayed enough, God would send one. So every night before she goes to sleep, she prays. She says, "Dear God, please send my mommy back to me, and if you can, please send my daddy too." Maddie lowered her hand from her mouth. Her lips trembled. "And she counts," Vince said, 1,247 times. "She counts every night. She said she's very good at counting." Maddie broke down. Not the quiet kind of crying, not tears slipping down her face without sound. She cried out loud. That cry cracked open in the hospital room like something that had been compressed for too long and had finally burst through her chest, uncontrollable, unwilling to be controlled. She cried for 8 years, for the nights spent in the hallway of the boarding house staring at the door of room 4B, for 9 months of pregnancy alone, for the morning she gave birth in a hospital with no one there to hold her hand, for 4 years of raising her daughter on a waitress's wages and meals she skipped so Ellie would have enough to eat, for the day she fell to her knees on the sidewalk screaming while they took her daughter away, for 3 years of sleeping on park benches, talking to pigeons, clutching a cloth bag with her daughter's photograph inside it, without knowing where her daughter was. She cried for all of it at once. And Vince sat there taking every sob because he knew that his name was inside every single tear. He reached out and took her hand. She jerked it away, fast, hard, as if burned. He reached for her again, took it again. She pulled away a second time, harder. Her eyes met his through the tears, full of fury, pain, and something else she hated herself for still feeling. The third time, he held his hand out slowly, gently. He didn't grab her. He only laid his hand beside hers on the sheet, palm up, and waited. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then back at his hand. The third time she didn't pull away. She placed her thin hand in his palm, lightly, trembling, and held on. Not tightly, only enough for both of them to know that the other hand was there. She kept crying. He didn't say "I'm sorry" because those 2 words were too small. He didn't say "I'll fix this" because he didn't know whether it could be fixed. He only sat there, holding her hand, in a 6th-floor room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, with the heart monitor sounding its steady rhythm and the light from the hallway spilling through the glass window in the door, and the 2 of them said nothing. Silence for a long time. Silence long enough for her tears to begin to ease, long enough for her breathing to steady, long enough for her hand to tighten around his just a little more, even though she didn't realize she was holding on more tightly. And Vince Carano sat there, the Mafia boss of Chicago, the man the entire city feared, holding the hand of the woman he had abandoned 8 years earlier, in silence. And for the first time in his life, he understood that there were things in this world that all the money and power on earth couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, couldn't command. The only thing he could do was sit there and stay. The following week, Vince did things that no one in his underground empire had ever seen him do. He hired the best family lawyer in Chicago, a man who specialized in child custody and child protection law, and began the legal process of getting Ellie out of St. Francis Children's Home. Neil Ashford sent the entire file on Renata Voss to 3 major newsrooms and filed a civil lawsuit in Cook County Court. Within a week, the name Renata Voss appeared across every legal news page in Chicago, tied to forged documents, financial fraud, and conspiracy to seize property. Her law license was suspended. Her accounts were frozen. The career she had spent her entire life building collapsed in a matter of days. Renata Voss left Chicago on a night flight, with no one seeing her off, no one knowing where she went, and no one asking. Every day that week, Vince went to the hospital. He came in the morning, left in the afternoon, and sometimes stayed until evening. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't bring gifts. He only brought himself, sat in the chair beside the bed, and stayed there. Maddie didn't speak much to him in the first days after she recognized him. Some days she turned to face the wall when he arrived. Some days she looked at him with an expression he couldn't tell was anger or sadness or both. But she never told him to leave, and he didn't leave. At the end of the first week, He brought Ellie from St. Francis to the hospital, under Sister Margaret's supervision. Ellie walked into the 6th-floor hallway, holding Sister Margaret's hand, her eyes moving around with more curiosity than fear. When she reached the doorway of the hospital room, she stopped. She looked inside, looked at the woman lying in the bed. Maddie looked toward the door, and when her eyes met those large, round, black eyes standing in the doorway, her face broke open. Not into tears, into something larger than tears. Into the face of a mother seeing her child again after 3 years and not daring to believe it was real. Ellie let go of Sister Margaret's hand. She walked to the bed slowly, one little step at a time, then stopped beside it and reached out her small hand to place it on her mother's hand. 1254, she said. Maddie looked at her daughter, tears running down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. What, baby? 1254 prayers, Ellie said, her voice calm and serious, as if reporting something very important. And God heard me. Maddie held her daughter, held her tightly, held her for a long time, held her as if the world would take her away again the moment she let go. Ellie wrapped her little arms around her mother's neck and whispered in her ear, I missed you, Mommy. I knew you'd come back. I counted every day. Vince stood at the door, his back against the wall, his hands hanging at his sides. His eyes burned. He didn't wipe them. He didn't turn away. He only stood there and watched the two of them hold each other on the hospital bed and endured the full weight of that moment. Because he knew he had to endure it. Because this was the consequence of the 8 years he had been absent. And also the 8 years he would never get back. 2 weeks after Ellie saw her mother again, Maddie was well enough to sit up, walk around, and speak normally for long stretches of time. Dr. Whitfield said she still needed continued treatment, but the most dangerous stage had passed. On the afternoon before Maddie was discharged, Ellie was sitting at the small table in the hospital room drawing. Vince and Maddie sat side by side in silence, watching their daughter draw. Then Maddie spoke, her voice calm, not angry, not hurting, only truthful. I forgive you, Vincent. He turned to look at her. Not because you deserve it, she said, meeting his eyes directly, but because I don't want to carry that weight anymore. I've carried it for 8 years. It's too heavy. And because Ellie deserves a family. Vince looked at her. Then he spoke with as few words as possible, but each word landed like a foundation stone for something he had never built before. I'm not leaving again. This time I'm staying. Ellie looked up from her drawing and stared at them both with those large, round black eyes. Daddy has to promise Pinky, she said seriously. A pinky promise is the real one. A mouth promise doesn't count. Vince Carano, the Mafia boss of Chicago, the man the whole city bowed its head to, held out his little finger and hooked it with the tiny little finger of a 7-year-old child. And the pinky promise made in that hospital room that afternoon was the truest promise he had ever kept in his life. The next day, the three of them walked out of Northwestern Memorial Hospital on an autumn afternoon. Ellie walked in the middle, her left hand holding her mother's, her right hand holding Vince's. Maddie was still weak, and she walked slowly, but she walked on her own feet. They passed by Grant Park. The late afternoon sunlight poured down golden as honey, exactly like the first afternoon when Vince had sat on that stone bench and heard that hoarse voice ask whether he wanted to play. Maddie stopped, looked into the park, then pointed toward the pigeons pecking at grain on the grass. Gerald. Ellie followed her mother's hand, looked at the fat pigeon, then looked up. Who's Gerald? And Vince Carano laughed, a real laugh. A laugh from deep in his chest. The kind of laugh he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that. Maybe 8 years earlier, in the hallway of the Southside boarding house, when a 20-year-old girl sang the wrong words to a song and had no idea she was singing it wrong. Vince Carano didn't believe in God. He never had. He believed in money, in power, in the force of fear. He built his empire with blood and darkness, and thought that was everything. But on an autumn afternoon in Chicago, a girl the world called crazy, dirty, hungry, wandering, sat down beside him on a park bench and said, I want you to play with me. God didn't send an angel with wings. God sent a girl in a torn hoodie, split-open shoes, talking to pigeons and giving them names. God sent the daughter he didn't know he had. God sent back the love he had once abandoned for ambition, for power, for the belief that the top mattered more than people. He had been wrong for 8 years. He had walked away, promised to return, and never came back. Let money speak louder than his heart, and carried that wrong inside his chest, like an old bullet. He didn't know he still held until someone touched exactly the right place. But God didn't ask him to pay for it. God gave back, because God always does, even for those who don't deserve it, even for those who don't believe. There are people born in darkness, people who live in darkness, people who kill in darkness. But all it takes is one person who isn't afraid of that darkness, one person who sits down and says, "Play with me," and even darkness has to step back. Vince Carano didn't believe in miracles, but he found a miracle on a stone bench in Grant Park, in the hoarse voice of the girl he had abandoned, in the large round black eyes of the 7-year-old child who had prayed 1,254 times. Miracles don't come down from the sky. Miracles come from the people the world has forgotten, but God hasn't. That is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. That in life, sometimes the people who seem strongest are the loneliest ones. That power can't replace presence. That money can't buy back the years that were lost. And that forgiveness isn't given because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve to lay down the burden. If this story touched your heart, please like it, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day brings more stories that stir the soul and are waiting for you. How did you feel after hearing this story? Have you ever left someone behind and later realized it was the worst decision of your life? Or were you the one who stayed, waited, and forgave? Share your story in the comments below, because we always want to hear the deepest things in your hearts, because every story deserves to be told, and every person deserves to be heard. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.